In step 2 of So You Want to be Taoiseach, Ardal O'Hanlon takes us through becoming a minister. So You Want to be Taoiseach, next on RTE1.
Now on One had to bag a portfolio and handle a scandal. Ardal O'Hanlon examines the rough and tumble of political life in So You Want to be Taoiseach.
In Programme 1, Lessons 1, 2 and 3, you managed to get in the party ticket, get elected to the Dáil and into the frame for a ministerial position. In Lessons 4, 5 and 6, things are going to get a bit more serious. So, do you have the determination to climb the ministerial ladder and the confidence to make the hard decisions? Do you have the guile to play the media game and ride out any scandal or controversy? Do you have the wherewithal to become the sort of political heavyweight that the party might look to as a potential leader? You're in line for promotion, a seat at the cabinet table. But which department offers you the best route to the very top and which ones hide the most pitfalls?
By and large, unless you've got that ministerial merc, the car with the star, as Pete Flynn called it, you're really not at the races. Traditionally, the bottom of the rung would be kind of things like defence and fisheries or the Gaeltacht or whatever. And then further up, you'll have justice and environment and education and all that.
Well, in terms of departments, it's a very time-sensitive thing. For example, I don't think many politicians would like to have been the Minister for, say, Enterprise, Trade and Employment in the 80s, when all you were dealing with was redundancies. These days, it's a great number to have.
To be in a department where you can make announcements is good for a political career, be it the Department of Agriculture, where it's the headage payments for the farmers, the Department of Education, where it's schools, building programme, or the Department of Transport. Announcements are good for ministers because it's positive, gets lots of local media coverage, and it makes them look as if they're doing things.
The worst ones really are something like justice. It's riddled with problems. If any judge makes a mistake, a prisoner breaks out, a row with the guards, you've all these sources of trouble for which you are ultimately accountable.
You have no real control over what criminals do, in the sense of they're out plying what they call their trade day in and day out. They're not saying to themselves, well, we won't rob tonight because the minister was quite nice to do something or other. You know, that bears no relationship to our lives, what they're doing.
As far as the Minister for Justice is concerned, she's a joke, and the administration of her office is a joke.
A lot of pressures on ministers, particularly in the big departments, or where you have to take decisions that may be the right decisions but may be unpopular. If you're a Minister for Health, and you're doing your job, you're going to be unpopular if you want to try and improve the health service in the longer run.
Don't become Minister of Health under any circumstances, because that ministry, which was dubbed Angola by Brian Cowan, has been the graveyard of many a political ambition.
The classic example of that was Michael Noonan and Bridget McCall. Now, Michael Noonan is not a cruel man. He's not a nasty man. But because he listened to the lawyers too closely, and because the lawyers told him to take a hard line against Bridget McCall, as distinct from taking the decision which empathy or emotion would have said, which was that this woman had been brutalised by the state, he took a legalistic, harsh position, and his career was irrevocably tainted.
I'm sorry for it. I know it caused great grief to the McCall family. As you come to the very top, there's the plum job that everybody seems to want foreign affairs, but the one that really counts is finance. You're not really considered nowadays Taoiseach material unless you've been in finance.
If you look at Bertie Ahern, he was Minister for Finance, as was Charles Haughey, as was Lynch, as was Lamass, as was John Bruton.
Finance is where to be, because what the Minister for Finance can do is he can do favours. He can look after members of the parliamentary party. So I think you set your sights on that.
By all means, set your sights on finance. But such a senior post is not going to come your way too soon. Your first ministry will be down the pecking order. But now that you're going to wield some real power, you'll have serious responsibility too. So don't get carried away.
Well, being a minister is completely different from being a deputy, either a backbencher or a frontbencher, because you are in fact the titular head of a pretty big organisation in most cases.
You know, as a minister, you had constituency office in your department that looked after the queries. They looked up the information before you signed the letters, so you didn't have to ring up a department yourself and ask what the answer to something was. There was somebody to do that. As a TD, there wasn't. You did it yourself. There's no point in us all saying, oh, you know, it's a very difficult job and all that. It is a difficult job, but there are some advantages.
You have a car, you have a driver, you have a staff. Your life is organised. You don't have to worry. If you're to go to Brussels for a meeting, you'll simply be taken to the airport and put in the government jet and collected at the other side. The minister says they want something and it's done for them. Speeches are written for them and they're very well paid.
I want to tell you something. Try it sometime when you have a couple of cars and 3 houses and 3 homes and a few housekeepers, and I want to tell you and everything else. But remember, it's a well-paid job.
Voters love having a minister in their constituency. To use that overused phrase, the minister delivers, in terms of the constituency very often.
So it's the new road, it's the factory, it is the grants and the access as well then for the constituency. That all flows from having your man or your woman at the cabinet table.
In my particular case, I saw the need for a new car ferry terminal, for example, in Dunlera, and I spent 21 or 20 million pounds at that time of taxpayers' money in building up a car ferry terminal, which has been hugely successful.
I was talking to a minister the other day and he said to me, you know, he said, I've got terrible flack because I gave more money and more grants to my constituency. He says, it's great for me, he said, because the more flack I get about that, the more they rally to me in the constituency and say I'm looking after it. And he says, I'll get a lot of votes out of this.
Pressure is one thing a ministerial position guarantees. But don't fret. You have the resources, the experience and the wisdom of the civil service at your disposal. You do, if they like you.
Minister, allow me to present Sir Humphrey Appleby, Permanent Under Secretary of State and Head of the DAA.
Hello, Sir Humphrey.
Hello and welcome.
Thank you, Sir Humphrey.
I believe you know each other.
Yes, we did cross swords when the Minister gave me a grilling over the estimates in the Public Accounts Committee
I wouldn't say that.
Oh, you came up with all the questions I hoped nobody would ask.
Well, opposition's about asking awkward questions.
And government is about not answering them.
Well, you answered all mine anyway.
I'm glad you thought so, Minister.
The Yes Minister thing, it's very entertaining. There's more than a grain of truth in it. But I think very few ministers are as daft as Hacker, or as easy to gull as he was.
The civil servants are very, very attuned to who they're going to get. And they hope sometimes, I think, the permanent government, that they'll get somebody malleable and who'll allow them to do the job as they see it.
If you come into government with a party that's been out of government for a long time, you're going to have the bigger job because, God forbid, you might have some new ideas and new policies. You might want to change things. And that's where you're going to run into terrible trouble with the civil servants, because the main thing a civil servant doesn't want to do is change anything. Everything must stay the same.
You can get sucked into the system and you can become a creature of the system. I think ministers who spend a lot of time out of their department really are not as much in control of it as they should be. The machine is getting on with the business. Now, by and large, the machine is going to do sensible things, but they're not giving the direction that they should give.
I remember
back in the mid-1990s when Michael Lowry was Minister for Communications. He was giving a press conference one day and he was with his department secretary sitting beside him. And I asked him a question about his telecoms policy, which clearly he was struggling to answer. And his department secretary interrupted him and said, excuse me, Matt, what the minister is trying to say is... Michael Lowry put his hand on the arm of the Department Secretary, John Lockery, and stopped him. And I think to everyone present, we thought, ooh, this is going to be embarrassing. Except what Michael Lowry said was, rather than telling John Lockery to stop, he said, and Matt, anything that the Secretary says, you can quote me as saying it.
You should almost know as much about the department as the civil servants do, because that's the only basis on which you can actually, with confidence, say in Cabinet that, yes, we can do this kind of thing, or if we want to do that, it's going to require, the following other things to be done.
Ah, yes, the Cabinet. The Holy Grail, as it were. The room where the most powerful people in the country make the key decisions that affect all of our lives. And you're now one of them. The minister sits in a set place. You can't just sit where you like. There's a set place for finance and the Taoiseach and agriculture, and it's the same for the 5 years or whatever it is. And your job is to bring the memorandum to Cabinet, or the aid memoir to Cabinet, for the particular piece of legislation or the proposal. And it's like almost a legal decision. So you're there as Mr. Agriculture or Mr. Finance or whatever it is. And it's quite formal, therefore.
Memoranda have to be circulated in advance. You can't just walk into the Cabinet and say, we're going to do A, B and C. Your papers have got to go around beforehand.
It was a time of huge cutbacks in education, absolutely huge. And I came with a memorandum. I wanted to set up a scheme called Home School Liaison, where there would be teachers who wouldn't teach, but they would go out into the homes in tough areas where kids weren't going to school. And Ray McSharry was the Minister for Finance, and he was a real tough taskmaster. So the Taoiseach said, what's this about? More teachers? And Ray McSharry said, yes, and they don't teach, Taoiseach. Imagine a teacher who doesn't teach. No, he said, let Mary tell her a story, so I did. And he said at the end of it, that's a very good idea, that will work. Can you do it on a pilot basis? And I did.
You don't come and discuss problems. For instance, Seamus Brennan told me about one of his early cabinet meetings when he was appointed to the cabinet by Charles Haughey, and he started to outline a problem he had in his department, and Haughey immediately cut him off and said, you don't come to this table with problems, you come with solutions. Back next week when you tell us what you're going to do.
So you generally went to cabinet where a conclusion had been agreed. And if it wasn't, the great word was, we'll park that, get the programme managers to talk to each other, sign off and come back. So long debates were unusual, but long agendas weren't.
I don't think they've standing up rows in Cabinet or anything like that. I think they avoid confrontation.
It's a famous story in the 1970s. Liam Cosgrave was Taoiseach and Brendan Corish was the Taoiseach. There was a row at a cabinet one day. The Taoiseach and the Taoiseach adjourned to his office and they didn't come out for the afternoon. Word spread around Leinster House, the government about to collapse. And it wasn't until Brendan Halligan, whose Labour General Secretary, was called to try and find out what was going on. He went up to the room, knocked on the door, went in and found the two guys watching the racing on television, and they drank most of a bottle of whiskey in the meantime, an empty bottle of whiskey, the racing on television, but they sorted out their problems.
Being in government means making decisions. Political ones, strategic ones, policy ones, hard ones, long-term and short-term ones. But most importantly of all, you've got to try and make the right ones. Because the stakes are getting higher. And it's your neck on the line.
Good ministers make decisions. And they'll be painful, and very often they lose votes. They may lose votes, but they'll be able to go to bed at night with their political conscience and saying, I'm doing what I believe to be the right thing for this country.
Oh, Lewis, did I get my head knocked in for 5 years about Lewis? Lewis shouldn't go here, it shouldn't go there, it shouldn't be, my shop has been ruined, my street has been ruined, I literally had my head done in. And the first day Lewis went on the streets, everybody loved it. And what you see now are shining faces pressed to the window and Lewis trundling along with all of its passengers. Now that was a case of sticking with the decision. We took the decision of where the lines were to be. And there was many a tremor and many a giddy spell throughout that period. But I said, no, it'll come okay. And it did. Tom McGurk calls me Mama Lewis now, which is kind of funny.
I had a huge room in the department, sitting on a chair where my feet barely touched the ground, and you'd say, first of all, I'm a mother. Secondly, I'm a teacher. Thirdly, I'm a minister. And that was how I took my decisions.
The smoking ban is an example of how you can actually change society, how you can change the way people live their lives in the common good if you are brave enough to take a decision and then to implement it.
Des O'Malley in 1972 and the offences against the state. I mean, the atmosphere in Ireland was not alone like anti-British, it was also ambivalent about the IRA. You know, what Conor Crusoe O'Brien described as a sneaking regardas, and there were many of them. And O'Malley put up with a hell of a lot of blackguardism during his period as Minister for Justice. That took courage.
And you have to take decisions that emotionally, emotionally they drain you dry and they hang you out like a strainer cloth. But intellectually, they're the correct ones to take. And unless you have the character to do that, it isn't every day that you're faced with a challenge of that magnitude. But if you haven't the talent to do that, I don't think you're going to make it in politics.
There are times in every minister's career when avoiding a controversial decision seems like the safer option. You know what it's like. You don't want to make a mistake or upset too many people. So you just stick your head in the sand.
In politics, there's always this temptation to avoid the hard decision, to avoid the unpopular decision. It's part and parcel of the nature of politics and politicians to do this.
How a minister can avoid that is the committee, the consultants, the task force. You farm out the issue to outside advisors and ask them to consult and have a look at it and examine it. That is delay. So by the time it gets back to your desk, or the problem issue gets back to your desk, you're hoping you're further on and you might even be close to the general election, or you've even been moved out of the department.
So there are times when it is good to get the views of a few people. I also think, though, at times we do use it as a kind of crutch and as a kind of, security blanket in a way to give us a bit of time to think about it and to not blame other people, but to spread the kind of odium, if it's going to be odium that's coming out, and say, well, this has been recommended by a highly significant, bunch of people.
The main thing if you're a minister is you have to try and deflect the blame. In the nursing home charges scandal, Micheál Martin is adamant that the possibility for a scandal didn't reach him.
This issue was not flagged as a substantive issue. There were not alarm bells ringing around either the meeting room or in advance of the meeting about this particular issue.
Every Minister of Health for, 30 years probably knew there was this terrible elephant in the room that nobody wanted to talk about. It was kept in the cellar. There was evidence suggested that Micheál Martin did know, more evidence that his predecessors all knew. The difference was Mary Harney went in and she actually did something about it.
But at the end of the day, you can avoid it, you can delay making the decisions. If you do, invariably, in my experience, they'll come back and they'll haunt you and they will damage you even worse than if you had dealt with them originally.
Whichever department you do lead, make the most of it. Work with and not for the civil servants. Listen to all the vested interests, but then make your own decisions and play your part at Cabinet. Now, do all of that well, and there's a fair chance you won't have to face the trials and tribulations of Lesson 5. A political career is a roller coaster ride. One moment you're top of the world, the next you're hurtling towards catastrophe. So if you do get into trouble, you need to know exactly what to do.
nobody's fault but mine.
First thing you must do is you must set your mind the following fact. It has taken you 15 years of toadying and creeping and handshaking and speeches and chicken and chips and all the rest to get there. So let's not resign. Let's get first principles right first of all.
Don't go out and face the microphones. Don't start issuing statements. Shut up. Shut up and find out what are the details. What's the nature of the scandal or the controversy? What are you being accused of? What did you do? When did you do it? Who did you do it with? Where did you do it?
You know, it's like a stone in water. Get to the bottom as soon as possible. Get to the point that it just can't get worse. But the worst thing is, a story breaks and it's a bad news story. And you put up a defence. And then you find 2 days later that defence falls apart and you have a new defence and then a new defence. Let's get all the manure out.
I think if you're looking for somebody who can handle scandals sublimely, I mean, the most recent one has to be Bertie Ahern in the Manchester Barters scenario.
In December 1993, Bertie Ahern was the Minister for Finance. In or around that time, he received payments from a number of individuals to help pay legal costs apparently incurred during his legal separation.
He went out and he gave all the facts. There was two different sets of payments, one of them wife and children money, you might say. And there was a second very dodgy payment of $8,000 in Manchester, which did not look pretty. But by throwing the whole lot in together, the Taoiseach diffused that.
You come out with your hands up and you said, I did wrong. Provided it hasn't cost the country, you know, hasn't put tuppence on the tax or something like that, people tend to admire honesty.
The second thing he did was that, in the classic example of business as usual, he raced around the country, surrounding himself with feel-good images of children cheering, old-age pensioners in wheelchairs saying, God bless you, Bertie, mate, you, all the stuff you've done for us, by almost being the political equivalent of a flying column. Because nobody could get more than the occasional single shot off at him, the Taoiseach reduced the possibilities of sustaining serious collateral damage.
Look, tactics come into it all the time. The Irish Times broke the story about the money that Bertie Ahern received while he was Minister for Finance. Did the Taoiseach go and give a full statement to the Irish Times responding to the queries it had raised? No. He went on national television instead because he wanted to control the circumstances in which he answered the questions. As it turned out, it was something of a masterstroke for him by doing so.
In the separation, I agreed to provide 20,000 for my children to an education account, and I did that.
He was able to do the tearful little bit. He was able to spin the conversation into the areas that he wanted to go into in a way that he wouldn't have been if he had responded to the print publication, which actually had the story.
And I also had to pay off other bills. So the money I'd saved was gone.
The third thing that he managed to do was that by dragging the scandal out into 2 weeks, everyone got bored.
So when you're in the manure business, cling on is the first golden rule. Just cling on. Just cling on. And just hope that the skies will, lift a bit. And then they do lift.
You won't always get out of it, but if you've got a neck like a jockey's bollocks, there's a good chance you might.
So, if you find yourself at the centre of a political storm, there are a few simple rules you need to follow. Bite your lip, and when you're good and ready, tell the truth, or as much of it as you can remember. Admit your failings with sincere regret. Exploit some positive photo opportunities, ideally bore everyone to death, and then pray for some other disaster to knock you off the front pages. And with a bit of luck, and perhaps some divine intervention, you should be able to keep your career on track.
You've reached the halfway point in your journey to the top. 5 lessons done, 5 more to do. You've hit the first rough waters of your career, but the important thing for a minister is that no matter what happens, never ever resign. But if for some reason you do want to throw it all away, here are some suggestions.
If you are caught doing something wrong, if you have made a genuine, honest mistake, say it and say sorry and mean it. If you try and mumble around it, fumble around it, well, yeah, I'm sort of sorry, but you have to understand the circumstances. People could see through that and people just go, go away, don't be annoying me.
If you look at the case of Ray Burke, it's not a personal scandal, but it was a political scandal. He was accused of graft, of being on the take and taking money. His strategy for dealing with it was to go into the Dáil and make a very heavily qualified statement in which he revealed that he had taken some donations, but had taken them as political donations as opposed to taking them as personal donations. But he made the fatal error of uttering the phrase, "I am now going to draw a line in the sand," as if this was the final word, that he had told everything.
As a member of the House, I made myself available for questions from members for an hour on any issue they wanted to ask. As far as I'm concerned, that's a line in the sand.
Unfortunately, when a politician tries to draw a line in the sand in the middle of a crisis, the general reaction of the media, at least, is to say, well, fuck you.
Whatever comes out of the woodwork from now on, the line is in the sand. As far as I'm concerned, from this day on is D-Day. I move on.
Maybe you think that you've drawn a line in the sand, but we think this is quicksand, so we're going to keep pushing and see what would actually happen.
And of course, it subsequently emerged that he hadn't told everything, and the line in the sand that he had drawn was washed over by the tide. If you don't say everything, it's inevitable that somebody is going to find out. And when somebody finds out, that they're going to tell the media. And when the media find out, your career is going to go down the toilet.
The European elections in 2004, Royston Brady had a fantastic profile in the Dublin constituency. At a very important time, I think it was about a week before the polls, an old hot press interview came to light in which he had suggested that his father had been a victim of those who were involved in the Dublin bombings.
The problem was that media decided this is Royston really trying to make his father a hero, and it's nonsense. It actually wasn't nonsense, it was totally true, but Royston disappeared.
We were in a process of interviewing all the candidates for the elections night by night on the programme, and Royston just wouldn't do it. So I decided to follow Royston around the place and stick a microphone under his nose. Now, the easy way for Royston to have dealt with it would have been to briefly talk to me and answer a few of the questions. But instead he started saying, "I'm not talking to you, I'm not talking to you," and running away from me. And that immediately turned it into the story that Royston was running away from the broadcaster with the microphone.
It definitely had a negative impact on him at the polls, and Royston trotted back into the wilderness.
I would just say to any politician, never be afraid of the truth. You see, the truth is great. You can never be caught out. You're telling the truth. So if other people choose to prevaricate or to tell a fib or two, you know you're right because you've told the truth.
So, it's not all doom and gloom. You can get into all sorts of scrapes and still live to fight another day. Think of John Bruton and his comments on the effing peace process. Martin Cullen and the whole e-voting shambles. Michael McDowell's overzealous description of Richard Goebbels' Bruton.
He is, I believe, the Dr. Goebbels of propaganda.
Emmett Stagg's unfortunate experience in the Phoenix Park. Kieran Cuff forgetting about some inherited family shares.
Well...
And what about Angus O'Snoddig, having an election worker who was later convicted of IRA membership amid allegations of a spying operation on members of the Dáil? As you can see, if you do screw up, you won't be the first and you certainly won't be the last. So, just lick your wounds, brush yourself down, and carry on as if nothing has happened. And we'll move on to lesson 6, the media game. Your relationship with the media will be crucial to your continued progress in politics. You need to understand how the media works and how you can use it to your advantage.
I think that for any minister who wants to be a Taoiseach, the old Phileas T. Barnum maxim that there's no such thing as bad publicity applies.
Journalists need stories, stories, stories. That's what they live and die for. That's what they breathe. And politicians are in a position to give them that. And likewise, politicians must have the journalists on their side.
Obviously, a journalist is looking for scoops and exclusives and so forth on an ongoing basis. If you can oblige in that way, great. Can you buy brownie points in return? I think you can. But it has to be a relationship based on trust and on not telling whoppers.
When I became Minister for Agriculture, I realised there was a whole coterie of agricultural correspondents. So I saw a great opportunity here. So any time we went on a food fair to Berlin or Paris, bring all the ag correspondents, bring them all in, you know, and actually I developed a great friendship with them.
And if you don't have your friends in the media to advertise what you're doing, it's a complete waste of time. When Mary O'Rourke first became Minister for Education, the first thing she did was send for the education correspondents of all the main newspapers, because she knew if she didn't have them on her side, any work she did was completely useless.
You need them and they need you, really. And if you're on speaking terms, if you know their first names, if you can say, hi, I'd like to talk to you, or something like that, it can help. It can certainly lubricate your daily work.
You leak it selectively to one of the papers or perhaps one of the radio stations the day before. Then that gives you your headlines for that particular day. You hold a press conference on that day and you get far more widespread coverage that evening and in the following morning's newspapers. So if you can have a couple of bites of the cherry, that stays in the public consciousness that small bit longer.
For a senior politician, 24-hour TV and radio means constant questions and demands instant reactions. Very easy to trip yourself up. So what you need to know is what not to say and how not to say it.
Roughly 80% of people get roughly 80% of their information and their impressions from radio and television. If you're not good in radio or television, then you failed to use a key conduit to reach the people that you have to reach.
I think politicians are obsessed with how they're perceived by the media, how they look and how they sound. The story is told in the 1980s when Charles Haughey was in opposition. He sent his frontbenchers out to Car Communications to get some media training, and two of those frontbenchers are Maura Geoghegan-Quinn and Pádraig Flynn, and they got a rough going over. You know, they do the mock interviews, taped it, looked back at it, and Pádraig Flynn, when they were assessing his contribution, Tom Savage, who was the media trainer, said, you know, you're a verbal terrorist.
None of us who knew Mary Robinson very well in previous incarnations ever heard her claiming to be the great wife and mother.
Can I interrupt the Minister?
Just a second, Michael. Now wait a moment.
Bad media training, or the assumption that they know themselves how to do it, involves answering questions like, well, I'm glad that you asked me that, or that's the question I wanted you to ask me.
I think any politician who would use the, you know, I'm glad you asked me that question line, you know, should be shot.
So many politicians have this habit of utterly ignoring the question that's been asked and trying to answer the question they would like to have been asked.
Well, let me explain. I was about to explain that. The Attorney General was, if you just listen, you get it's quite complicated, so I just want to listen for a second.
And the terrible shame then is when politicians get to a certain level, they'll be whisked off and given the media training and have all their personality and humour and direct speaking beaten out of them practically. Before Michael Noonan became a leader of the Fine Gael party, people loved him. He was a warm, funny character who could always be relied upon, you know, for the bit of humour and for the plain speaking.
In this constituency, it has been suggested that you're fighting an uphill battle to keep your seat.
I don't think I am, you know. I'm fighting a battle, all right, but then I never had an easy election.
And as soon as he became leader of Fine Gael, he lost all that.
It's all very well knowing what not to say if you don't know what you should say, if you know what I mean. And for that, you need to learn a language that is unique to politics, where what you say is not necessarily exactly what you mean. Let me give you a few examples. This issue is receiving serious attention at government level. We're going to park it until after the election. I have no intention of. I might if I have to, The party is absolutely united on this. You could drive a lorry through the cracks in the party. The Minister has my complete confidence. What a complete gobshite. You see what I mean?
There's undoubtedly a need to learn how to phrase things. Number one, for clarity, and number two, to avoid provoking other questions that don't have much to do with what you're saying.
If I have 5 minutes on prime time on any programme and I'm there, this is my big opportunity. It's a very short soundbite. There are 2 or 3 key points I want to get across. And they're relevant to the issue. No matter what I'm asked or what my defensive weakness Achilles heel is, I must get those, because those are the points in which I can persuade the public that I'm right on here.
I'll be quite frank about it. Tuesday week, before I did a deal with the Russians last Saturday at 1 o'clock in the VIP lounge in Dublin Airport, the Iranians demanded that Munster be taken out.
I mean, you have to entertain the hard question, and you have to say that obviously this is a matter of the gravest concern, and it's receiving attention from the government, but we are also extremely concerned to ensure that, and you're off galloping away in some more comfortable terrain.
Why isn't this bill going through swiftly?
It's a more complex piece of legislation. I think it's important that we would get it right. But we have changed the inspection system at the moment. We have a much more robust system at the moment.
One of the things that an awful lot of politicians learn from media training is to listen very carefully to what your opponent or the interviewer says. You'll often see politicians in this regard hone in on the smallest aspect of what their opponent has said, and they use that to their greatest advantage.
So why should anyone around the country have confidence that if they have a mother or father, an elderly relative in a home, that they are being treated properly?
Well, if I could just pick up the point that Sean has identified a very important point here. The simple and easy solution.
You do have to make sure that you say what you want to say, and for my money, I think you have to find a way of saying it, as economically as possible, because, said he, proving the point, there's nothing that annoys people more than somebody who's rabbiting on forever about some issue.
In politics, first impressions last, and style very often overshadows substance. So, if they don't like your policies, change them. And if they don't like the way you look, you can change that too.
If you want to be a politician, the moment you set foot outside the door in the morning, you're on. And you should be dressed for being on.
You look like an angel.
It doesn't matter what's going on behind closed doors. It's how you are perceived. And so that's the trick that you need to pull off.
But I got wise. You're the devil in disguise.
Cleavage, which can speak louder than the politician who owns it, particularly to men, and you don't want to do that. Or indeed chest blushing, because when women blush under pressure, they don't just blush there, they blush on their chest. I was very amused years ago when there was the first really large group of women getting in simultaneously into Dáil Éireann. The Late Late Show at the time decided, hey, we'll have them all on. And something like 9 out of 14 of them wore blue jackets.
They are brand new women in Dáil Éireann, let's give them a round.
It was like a nightmare version of Mosney.
Our current Taoiseach was known for a long time as the anorak man. I don't think anybody would describe him as that now. He's had plenty of makeovers, even though he wouldn't claim to be the epitome of sartorial elegance or anything, but he certainly has worked on his image. That's very much becoming a bigger part of politics than it used to be.
But now there is a belief, even among politicians, that you have to be in some way false and phony and pre-packaged and full of spin before you're going to get elected. Now, I simply don't believe that. I believe that people, voters, have an instinct for who's real here, and they're always trying to get past the spin thing into the thing that makes them say, I would trust your man.
But like if you're a total phony, I mean, you'll be found out.
Like, the press can only build you up so far, and of course they'll knock you down as quick. But like the public, you deal with the public on a daily basis, they'll find you out. They're not waiting for the papers to tell them.
2 programmes down, only 1 more to go. The Taoiseach's office is getting closer. Through lessons 4, 5 and 6, you gained ministerial experience, survived a few political storms and mastered the language of politics. You are now ready, as a respected political heavyweight, to take the next step and mount a challenge for the leadership of your party. See you next week.